So William Ong is a very fascinating thinker. Guy Senstock and Dr. Anton had a great talk on Ong. And the idea that we talk about in Belonging Again 2.2 is that for Ong we can say that after writing, the very kind of internal space of human beings shifted. What we mean by that is when you had oral tradition, then most of the mind was used to memorize. It was holding something. It was for memorization. What Ong suggests is that after printing and writing, then we freed up our mind. We could use it for more space. We could get as Dr. Samuel Lunkar so beautifully puts it, a more kind of flexible memory, a kind of more flexible mind, flexible creativity. Dr. Lunkar I really like. He has an essay in Theory Underground's anthology, in the Underground Theory anthology, where he talks kind of about this, Dr. Samuel Lunkar. But what this means is that there's a kind of internal capacity. And what Dr. Anton gets into is the idea that before writing, when humans felt something, they almost instantly had to express it. They were kind of more susceptible to cause and effect. If they were angry, they would speak angrily. It just was very, very quick. After writing, we gained a greater internal space. So we could feel anger, but not necessarily act on that anger. So we could kind of hold more inside. And that this qualitative change also allowed us to, come up with, for Ong, basically, it's the possibility of the scientific treatise and creativity and so on and so forth. So, but all of this is afforded by the medium changing, oral to writing to paper. And of course, this could be, the question is, how else might subjectivity of the human be shifted by the medium as you move to, say, the internet or the phone or whatever? If humans contain a greater inner capacity, then we're able to contain more. But you see, you could also argue that means there's a space in which humans could withdraw. And that might be nihilism or loneliness or separation or stuff like that. Also, perhaps if we get hurt, it can be deeper because we can hold it inside. We can't instantly vent it. So there are some, there's some tragedies here. And we've been talking, there's some trade-offs. I say tragedies based on Martha Nussbaum's ideas and fragility of goodness. But there's trade-offs, that's the point. This inner capacity for human beings gives us science, and creativity and all that, making possible the modern world and the explosion of wealth with the great enrichment, McCloskey, etc. But it then also, of course, then creates the possibility of nihilism, withdrawal within the self, the loss of the social. Because if you can withdraw into yourself, then you don't have to be social. But of course, that means you could also have a kind of deeper social, a more free social that you choose, given and with your inner capacity. But it might be harder, and the emotional negativities that arise with others might be deeper and held within. So there's some trade-offs there. So there's a few points we want to note here. William Ong is providing a suggestion that mediums change subjectivity itself, like human subjectivity itself. It's not simply that when we get the newspaper, we have a different way to express information, or a more efficient way to express information. That's of course true. But the main thing that Ong wants to highlight is that we now have an entire new subjectivity by which to approach the human and to think the human. This has now been afforded to us by the medium condition. Considering that, if indeed we're in Belonging Again looking at some sort of new subjectivity, childhood, that is necessary for a new theopolitical address, to reference Cadell's thinking, then the medium condition is probably a big part of the equation. it's probably something that we can consider as very, very important. So we should note that. And this is where, of course, the social coordination mechanism becomes such a big deal in Belonging Again, because that indeed could be a new medium that could afford a new kind of subjectivity that could possibly help us spread childhood, which we can also associate with the effort to not grow any faster than the speed of relationships, as Cadell has put it, and I completely agree. And I suggest his new book, Real Speculations, highly. So that's there. The other thing that this should note is that we've not really had to deal until after the death of God, the death of a paradigm, Nietzsche, as Bard puts it with Nietzsche. We haven't had to deal that plus a great inner capacity in this way. The Ongian, I almost want to say Ongian capacity or something, but that, whatever. So now you could say one of the reasons we have a new challenge today is because we've undergone the death of God, the gradual collapse of bestocentrism, or at least now we relate to bestowing sources as pathological. And we have the greater inner capacity. And that's probably why we have a mental health crisis. That's probably why we have, all the madness we have, is because of this very problematic combination. So our address, our new address can be located in that contradiction or that tension, etc. Now, basically also we could say that the inability, that inner capacity, because we've already talked about the great enrichment, the solo residual, we've already talked about those things. We could say that inner capacity is what that Ongian, I'm just going to call it here. I don't call it this in the book, but that Ongian capacity is both what gave us the great enrichment, and also of which has made us susceptible to paralyzing ourselves when we face negativity, and the very great enrichment that Ongian capacity bestowed or made possible, also increases the likelihood of greater complexity, in which negativity, in a Hegelian sense, negativity, contradiction, pain, just say pain. There's a greater likelihood today of pain, surprise of pain. And so that's a problem, because the inner capacity then, of which affords us a capitalism of non-zero sumness, also in that wealth creation sets up the conditions to reverse the inner capacity against itself. And that's irony. That's the irony. And irony is the fabric. This is why irony is such a big deal for O.G. Rose. So we have to somehow, and again, if medium condition affects subjectivity so much, it's probably the case that addressing this irony is going to involve a medium condition of some kind, a new medium. And for us, that's going to be the social coordination mechanism. Now, another thing. Belonging Again 2.1 will also talk about capital, compression, the pleasure principle. And that's relevant here. Because when we have greater inner capacity, the more we long for stability, existential stability, and that will make givens and compression and flattening strategies more tempting to us. And that's where a certain devolution of capital seems likely. Let me explain. So, it seems as if capitalism are conditions of possibility for great wealth that then fall back into a stagnation. And one of the reasons for this can be, we can understand if we start thinking Marx. Marx, and we've touched on this, but to say just a little review on it. Marx, at the beginning of the Capital, wants us to kind of ask the question, or at least to kind of be in wonder. It's almost like Socrates. Philosophy starts in wonder. There's a sense in which the capital starts in wonder. And it's asking, how does a society come to believe that things are fungible and exchangeable? And how do we come to think that, say, 2 bushels of wheat equals 1 apple tree? I genuinely believe that. That's kind of weird. There's no equal sign in reality. Nothing is actually fungible. And yet, in some very odd way, we come to believe, genuinely believe, that things are exchangeable. Furthermore, we genuinely come to believe that things are, say, worth $20. Oh, that chair is $20 or something. He's always talking about Lenin. So maybe, I think Nance joked that it's because Marx is always talking about Lenin, that Lenin followed Marx. It's kind of funny. But anyway, we generally come to see things as something not in facticity, prices. And there's kind of a question of why is that so easy for us to do? Like, to come to actually literally live as if that fungibility is a fact of nature, as if it is given by things, it is given over, it is in things. Well, I think first off, Marx is pointing to sociology before it's a thing. I guess sociology is more of the 1850s or later, Comte, Saint Simon, maybe Comte. But the idea is that I think in Marx we see a beginning of sociology. I'm not saying he's just a sociologist, but at least some kind of social analysis, because that question is tied to the existence of what Peter Berger called plausibility structures. Which the question is, it's all about, Peter Berger talks about how we can't understand reality without categories, very much like Mary Douglas, and that's why I'm bringing that up. We've already talked on that, but is the idea that we need some categories of thought to be as authoritative to us or plausible to us for us to even make sense of reality. If not, we're in trouble. And the way that Peter Berger basically in the social constructs of reality, kind of we'll get into, is how we necessarily arrive at these categories through, social orders, others, institutions. It is through others, and the fact that others believe it, that we create a certain fabric that give our beliefs a certain grounding. We believe because our neighbor believes. It's the idea that the faith dies by the congregation, which is a funny wording, but it's very important, because it's not that faith dies by the individual, becoming an atheist or something. The faith dies because the congregation goes away, and nobody has the existential stamina to hold up their beliefs by themselves. It's too heavy of a demand, certainly for the average person. I mean, I shouldn't say nobody. Let's say for the majority, the high majority. No one has the existential strength to maintain a worldview all by themselves without being crushed by doubt, uncertainty, anxiety, unless they're psychotic, meaning they close themselves off from the other, thus atomize. So where plausibility structures are lacking, for our own existential stability, we are prone to, move to the psychotic in Lacan, which is an enclosed structure from a neurotic, it's an enclosed structure. Or nihilism, one or the other. Anyway, Marx basically identifies that we come to believe in exchange value, fungibility, equal signs, because of plausibility structures and social order. So you really can't, therefore, separate capitalism. Now, of course, the argument Marx makes is a lot longer than this, but right there is the suggestion we cannot separate cleanly society and capitalism. Capitalism is always already a sociology. And sociology is always already a certain political economy. And so there's a sociology in capital. And sociology has a lot to do with the birth of authoritative categories. So you could say social metaphysics almost, and grounding, without which we fall into a certain madness. Well, in that sense, the logic of society is a certain compressing. It's the removal of possibility for the sake of stability. And we, as humans, find pleasure in understanding. And this is where we start bringing in the pleasure principle, Lacan, Freud, etc. And basically the idea is that it's pleasurable to understand. And the brain is in the business of pleasure, not truth. This is Freud, and you could even say just a kind of huge thrust of psychoanalysis. The brain is drenched in libidinal. It's a libidinal. The brain is not a rational, objective structure. Now, very important, that is often overstated to suggest that the brain can't think at all. That nothing the brain thinks is truth. Is true. It's only survival. It's not really about truth. It's just about pleasure. I think this is too much. The brain does want to know what's true to survive. It does want a useful map. And a useful map is more pleasurable than a useless map. And if you don't have any sense of truth at all, you will not know how to survive, and you'll probably be overwhelmed by fear. And so the libidinal quality of the brain does not mean it has no interest in truth, nor that it cannot be trusted, anything like that. I think that's overreach and overstated. However, if we take it seriously, as I think we should, that the brain is libidinal, then we need to be aware that the brain, if the brain must choose between pleasure and truth, it will naturally sacrifice truth for pleasure. It will not sacrifice pleasure for truth naturally. That would take work. And it would take work. It would take the love and sweat of our lives. The sweat and blood of our lives. We'd have to do it forever. Because just as soon as we're, sure that we've gotten better, that's when the brain tricked us and we lost. So there's a certain, ultimately will require drive. There's a drive that is necessary for this to work, we might say. And if we don't have that drive, then it ain't going to work. And that, of course, is looking ahead to belonging again. The issue is the sociological condition of capital creates ample opportunities for the brain to sacrifice truth for pleasure in the form of understanding. Because the claim I am making, which perhaps is a axiom or a presupposition, I don't think so. I think it's true to experience, but sure, we can argue it, is that it is pleasurable to understand something. And it is uncomfortable to not understand something. This is also alluding to the Ethics of Belief by C.S. Peirce. He claims that the brain is in the business of, being comfortable, just like I'm claiming. And I think Peirce is right. I think also it's probably not a good idea to argue against C.S. Peirce because he's unbelievable. Anyway, he basically, again, Ethics of Belief, tremendous essay. And I highly suggest it. But, it's pleasurable to understand. Well, when I say that this cup is worth $5, it feels like I understand the cup. And that's pleasurable. And now we're getting at, I think, why the commodity form is so easy to spread across the human race, and why it's so easy for the sociology of capitalism to take hold of societies. Because it gives us ways to feel like we understand reality, even though we don't. If I ask you what is a cup, and you don't have at hand, like a tool in Heidegger, $20, then you have to explain what a cup is. You have to go into details, history, all that stuff. And that's much harder and doesn't feel like understanding nearly in the same way as does just saying the cup is $5. So price, commodity, all of that gives us a way to feel like we understand reality. And now we can start to see why the spread of capitalism is so natural at the expense of creativity. And so this is getting to our point, kind of tying to the other, recordings we've done in the car. Because the commodity form of which comes out of the Ongian, which is enabled by the Ongian capacity, which gives us a great enrichment, etc., so forth. The commodity form that comes out of that, with the great enrichment, can then be used as a means to understand reality that's pleasurable, which then trains us out of the complexity, I'll just say that, or multi-dimensional thinking necessary of the subject to be creative, for capital to be non-zero sum, and for wealth to be generated, without which capital stagnates, dehumanization, manipulation versus conviviality, and the human is replaced by AI, and so on. All of that then follows. So, this is the key irony. Capitalism generates a commodity form. So capitalism, non-zero sum, creative capitalism, let me just say that here, and I'm thinking McCloskey and all that. Creative capitalism generates the commodity form that makes at hand a way to understand reality according to price in a single dimension, compresses complexity into a single variable, exchangeability, of which then creates a habit in the human who does that, which takes them away from the capacity to be creative, without which capital becomes zero-sum and auto-cannibalistic. So that's the loop. And that's what we're in. And that's why belonging again, when it's talking about the belonging again as an address, is not just about feeling nice. It's practical. It's practical. It's economic. It's not just it's an economic matter. And in that sense, I would argue it's more practical than most pragmatism. It's more in a sense utilitarian than most utilitarians, because it is a certain reestablishment or regaining, with the RE in parentheses or something, a certain regaining of the ground, or space, or whatever term. It's a regaining of the ground of the possibility of the pragmatism that accompanies the capitalism, which needs that ground to be itself. So in a sense, belonging again wants to recover the ground of pragmatism, and in that way, it is more practical than most practical things. It is more pragmatic than most pragmatism, so on and so on and so on. And that's kind of the irony, is that belonging again, in critiquing what's practical, in critiquing economics, is actually trying to afford greater economics, if you will, greater practice, greater utility. It's like C.S. Lewis said, you have to put first things first, and you get second things also. And if you put second things first, you lose both. A very, very useful heuristic. It's always at hand to me. I use that all the time, which could be evidence of bias or evidence that it's true. Not just something Lewis said, but it actually is just the nature of reality in its gestalt and mystery. But that means belonging again is about a certain right ordering of economics. That if we as humans can't belong again, then we also can't be great again, quote unquote. We can't be great again. We can't be really dynamic again. We can't be rich again. We can't be convivial again. We can't be ourselves again. Much more can be said, but in a sense, I suppose these recordings has been getting at the stakes of belonging again, at least kind of tracing out some of the stakes, to suggest that the question of belonging again is not simply an emotional stability, something to deal with the meaning crisis, nihilism, mental health, whatever, although it is about that, the claim is that those things are also economic matters. The meaning crisis is an economic matter, you could say in a weird way, because it's a motivation matter, and motivation in economics is all about motivation. And so there's a certain consilience in this. E.O. Wilson was famous for consilience, the idea of a certain convergence of humanities and science and all of these together in a certain just coming together. I think motivation is the space of consilience. Asking about motivation, which of course is drive and desire and psychoanalysis, motivation is all of it. Is love, beauty, all of these terms, conviviality, all of these are tied to questions of motivation. I think the consilience of E.O. Wilson is possible in a consideration of human motivation, because I don't think we can really understand the human unless we understand our motives. It's just like a mystery novel, right? You can't really understand the killer or whoever until you understand his motives. It's no different. Belonging again, in a sense, is about getting at the motives of man and women and children. What are our motives? And if we can't belong again, in a sense, this means we can't have motivation again, and that means we can't be great again. We can't be non-zero again, non-zero sum again. And those are the stakes of belonging again. Now, the question is simply if the project manages to rise to the occasion of those stakes, but that is something of which readers will have to decide.